If you see the house appear, stay inside. Written by Gabie Rivera. Check the link in the description for more of their stories. The house first appeared 2 months ago, after a nearby orphanage burned down. I'm not sure if the two events are related, but I don't think that knowing that would really change anything. The house shows up at the top of Moon Hill, which is the only hill in town, located on the west side past the empty fields. There isn't really much over there. The fields were once used for farming years ago, but they've been empty for the past few decades except for the overgrown weeds and grass. The house looks innocent enough, and if you were driving by, you would think it was just a nice house, located on a hill with a perfect view of the whole town. But it's much more than that. It's a brick colonial-style home with 3 stories. It's not very large and doesn't even take up the entire top of the hill. There are 5 windows on each floor of the house except for the first floor, which only contains 2 windows on either side of the front door. There are no windows on the sides or back of the house. It has 3 brick steps that lead up to the white door, with black iron railings on either side of the steps. The windows were always covered with thick black curtains, and had I never seen anyone step out of the house, I would think it were empty. I noticed it the first time it appeared at around midnight 2 months ago, but I have no idea how long it was there before I happened to notice it. I was sitting at my desk in my bedroom, which just so happens to be facing the fields and Moon Hill. I looked up at the night sky as I waited for sleep to finally come. That's when I noticed the silhouette of the house as the moon was shining behind it. I thought I was dreaming at first, or imagining things at the very least. But then the porch light turned on and I watched, squinting in the dark as a single file line of people came out of the house. They marched down Moon Hill, silently, and through the fields straight into town. I lost sight of them after that since there were no lights to show me where they were, and so I decided to get into bed. As I was laying down, getting ready to close my eyes, the screaming started. It was only 1 or 2 distant voices at first, and I thought it might be random, but within seconds the screaming got louder, and it was clear that it was coming from multiple people. I sat up once again and walked back to the window, looking down and trying to spot the source or the location of the screaming, but I couldn't see anything. The screaming continued to slowly sweep through town until I could tell that some of the voices were coming from inside the apartment building. I made my way to the front door and pressed my ear against it as the voices continued to get louder and closer, until I could hear my neighbor across the hall screaming, and then, almost as soon as it started, the screaming stopped abruptly, and an eerie silence fell upon the entire town. I listened intently to the silence, trying to pick up on something, anything that might clue me in as to what was going on. But I couldn't hear anything at all. I slowly tiptoed back to the window and looked out into the night, just in time to see the single file line walk out of the town and back into the house. The porch light turned off and everything was still. The next morning, there were dead people everywhere. Homeless people who slept in the park were dead. People who had been out on the street during that time of night were dead, as were people who had been simply sitting outside their homes or apartments. All of the bodies were found the same way. Gray. Laying on the ground, staring up at the sky with wide eyes, and drained of blood. It took a while for the bodies to be cleaned up, but afterward we were told that there were over 50 of them. Officer Murphy's wife was going around town saying that vampires were the cause of death. and that her husband had told her that all of the bodies had 2 small puncture wounds in the necks. Even though that sounded ridiculous, the rumor spread fast, and people were scrambling to buy random items that they thought would keep the vampires away. Apparently, no one else had noticed the house appear on Moon Hill, and so the general consensus was that there was a vampire in town. It became chaotic as people tried to guess who it was. I didn't tell anyone about the house until the second time it showed up, at the end of that same month. It turns out that the second time, a group of teenagers who were camping in the woods had also noticed the house appear, and the people who came out of it and headed into town. That time, the death toll was almost double what it was the first time. A couple of officers headed up to Moon Hill to check out the area, but found no evidence that a house had ever been there. And everyone stopped talking about the mysterious house, until the third time it showed up. One of the officers who worked on the night shift had driven out to the fields to meet up with his mistress, and happened to notice when the house appeared that night. He was able to notify the other officers of what he saw before they got to him and his mistress. And a couple of minutes later, the entire town was filled with the sound of sirens as police cars raced towards the west side of town to confront whoever it was coming out of the house. That night was loud, filled with the sounds of gunshots and screaming, and by the time the people returned to the house, all of the officers were dead. On the plus side, they didn't make it all the way through town that time. After that, we all got an alert, telling us to stay indoors and away from windows whenever the house appeared. It worked, and the fourth time that the house appeared, the only deaths were those of the few teens who thought it would be cool to sneak out and see the vampire people that were coming out of the house on Moon Hill. That's what everyone was calling them now. The vampire people. I felt like something else was going on, although I had absolutely no idea what it could be. The fifth time the house was set to appear, I had a plan ready. A couple of minutes before midnight, I drove out to Moon Hill and parked behind it. I turned off my car and waited for the house to appear. Once it did, I waited for the porch light to turn on. And then I waited for the people to walk outside and towards the town. Once they were past the fields, I got out of my car and made my way up the hill and around to the front of the house. To my surprise, the front door was unlocked, and despite the fact that my brain was practically screaming at me to not go in, I opened the door and stepped into the house. The front door opened to a foyer, with wooden floors and a giant staircase that led upstairs into darkness. There were 2 doors, one to the left of the foyer and one to the right. I decided to open the door on the left first and walked into a giant room that was empty, except for a broken chandelier that hung in the middle of the ceiling. I walked out of the room and closed the door behind me, and then walked to the door on the right and opened it to find the same. Another empty room, except this one had a fireplace instead of a chandelier. I finally decided to make my way upstairs and quickly walked up the staircase as I could hear some screaming now. I got to the second floor to find that it was just one giant room. Only this one wasn't empty. There were large bags hanging from the roof, more than 20 from what I could see. I slowly made my way towards the nearest bag and reached out to touch it. It was extremely cold to the touch. As I moved my hand around, I began to recognize the shape of the thing that I was touching. It was a body. I was groping a dead body. I backed away from the bag and made my way through the rest of the bags, making sure not to touch any more of them. I got to the second staircase and quickly made my way up to the third floor. The screams had begun to die out, which meant that the people would be back at the house soon, and I did not want to be here when that happened. When I got to the last room, I saw more bodies, only these were inside giant glass containers, floating in some sort of clear liquid. These bodies were also recognizable. They were the same people who had been attacked and killed in town during the past few weeks. Each container was numbered, and there were 5 of them toward the back of the room that were still empty. I estimated that there were maybe 60 or so containers in this room alone, meaning that the rest of the bodies had to be on the second floor, still in the body bags. More confused now than ever, I raced back down the stairs and ran out of the front door. When I got outside, I could see the line of people headed back toward the house. I didn't want to risk being seen running back to my car, and so I crouched by the side of the house and watched as the people walked back into the house in silence. I counted over 20 people, most of them children. And for a second, the thought that these were somehow the same kids from the orphanage that burned down crossed my mind. When the last person went into the house, I ran back to my car and got inside, locking the doors. I sat in silence and waited for a few minutes for the house to disappear once again. Once it was gone, I drove back home, passing by exactly 5 dead bodies. I didn't think I would sleep that night, but I ended up passing out eventually. The next morning, I found my bedroom window open and a letter on my desk. Dear Celine, sorry that we missed your visit last night. I'm sorry to say that we have moved on to a different town now, as we've got everything that we came for. You must be alarmed by what you saw, and I honestly don't blame you. It would be an odd situation to walk into for anyone. I would, however, like it if you joined us. I have included the location of our next town. Come if you'd like. Sincerely, the Vampire People.